Well, our Constitution is an owner's manual for a free, sovereign nation. And you would think that inside that owner's manual, if we are a democracy, that somewhere in those pages it would say so. It makes sense. I don't think there's a big debate there. Well, it's not in there. In fact, Article 4, Section 4 states that every state will be guaranteed a Republican form of government. So, what's the difference between the two? It's not a question of semantics. A lot of people like to hyphenate. Well, we're a democratic republic or something like that. Or you hear the term People's Republic versus a republic. And one of an answer to the People's Republic versus a republic is like the difference between a chair and an electric chair. The word republic stems from the Latin, res publica, the public thing. Democracy stems from the Greek, the strength of the people. Now, a lot of people think that majority rules the way we should have it. Well, our founding fathers knew they knew history very, very well, and they knew what happens when majority rules. We don't have majority rule. We have rule by law, republic, where the rights of the minority are protected in spite of the wishes or the whims of the majority. And when I say minority, I'm not necessarily talking about people of a different color skin or different religious or racial group. If 89% of the people, for example, wanted to outlaw a certain thing, but they didn't have the constitutional mandate to do that, then nothing they can do about it. Theoretically, in a Republican form of government, we hear a lot about polls. The polls say this, the polls say that, and so the politicians will use polls to say that, well, we should do this because the majority of the people say we should. Well, that's nonsense. Because even if the rights of one person were infringed, they had no right to do that. And we do have democratic elections. And in fact, I had a young lady come to one of my information tables a few years ago, and she didn't really understand it, and I was trying to explain it to her. So I gave her an analogy, which I just had thought up, I guess, at the time. And I said, in a republic, I said, in a house, in a mansion, you have a lot of different rooms and different size rooms. I said, the kitchen in this mansion is not the mansion. She says, well, of course not. It's part of it. I said, well, within the framework of a republic, we have democratic elections, and I'm very glad we have them. We elect our members of the House of Representatives, you elect your governor, you elect your state reps. However, when they're elected, there's something that keeps them in check. They can't just say, well, I have a mandate from the people to outlaw all cars, for example, so we're going to do that. You can't do that because you have a republic, you have a form of government, you have a constitution that tells you what you're supposed to do, your job description.
See, this is the problem that I think that many of the people in the listening audience and in the United States in general have. It's the problem that they do not understand, A, what's in the Constitution, B, what the Constitution is supposed to do, and how it's got to the point from when the Constitution was first written and created for whatever reason, how it got to be now where we're in such a mess, and we seem to have lost total control. We don't have the rights anymore that we had before.
Well, a lot of people, there is a mindset, an unfortunate mindset, our Constitution is outdated. It was written for an agrarian society back 200 plus years ago. We had a population of 2 million, and it's really not valid. Or the Constitution is living and breathing, and that it's interpreted differently every so many years. Well, I don't like the word interpret because it was written in the English language. You know, if it was written in Greek, if it was written in Hebrew, then you'd need an interpreter, someone who could, okay, what do they mean by that? Some of the language is a little archaic. We don't use it anymore, but you can easily get an old dictionary to find out what some of those words meant. The Constitution is as valid today than it ever was because it doesn't deal with technology so much as it deals with human nature. And human nature doesn't change much. As much as some of these educators want to think and believe, human nature doesn't stay pretty much the same. I think King Solomon wrote in Proverbs that there's nothing new under the sun. That human nature is, and our nation's founders realized that. And they knew that they could not trust, even the most well-intentioned people can go awry without some kind of, as Thomas Jefferson said, the chains of the Constitution.
And you had mentioned before, too, that a problem people have is when you mention democracy and you mention republic, right away they think of the political parties and right. The separation of that.
And it's got nothing to do with political parties. It has something to do with fundamental fundamental definition. Republic and democracy are two as different as night and day.
Well, the problem is, I guess, unless you're fresh out of your political science classes or you're highly
And
involved.
that's the worst place to get this, for the most part. That's a bad place to get this information.
Now, because it's all changed, is that correct?
I would
And what
say
they
so.
teach you.
I'd say there are some very good professors, but you'd find most of the professors teaching that we're a democracy or some type of republic-democracy. And you get into the political spectrum, we will a little bit later, you'll say that certain people are right-wingers and other people are left-wingers, and of course it's a complete misdefinition.
And I think also that if you were to, I know you don't like the word polls, but if you were to ask and question people that are out there running their everyday lives now, what is a Democrat? Can you define a Democrat? Can you define a Republican? What does it mean to be right-wing, left-wing? Many people do know that, granted, but there's many people out there, the voting public, that doesn't have a clue to the definition of what this all means. So how do we make an intelligent choice when we come to the polls? Not that we have a choice as it is.
Well, that's one reason why there was a John Birch Society. The founder, Robert Welch, back in the early 50s, ran for political office in Massachusetts, lieutenant governor. As he traveled around the state, he was shocked to find the constitutional illiteracy, not by people who were just the poor and hungry people, but by people who were well educated, graduates of college, people in the business community. They didn't understand or appreciate the document that made a lot of our freedoms possible, and they took it for granted. And he realized that every 2 years or 4 years you have elections and everyone gets excited, but usually after the smoke is cleared and all the party hats have been put away, the change has been minimal, if there has been a change at all. And so he realized that we need to educate people about that Constitution and about the proper role of government. And if you didn't have the informed voters, you're not going to have the proper people elected. It's going to be a perennial fraud, really, is unfortunately what it's become.
Well, we're speaking with Harold Shurtleff, who is the New England coordinator for the John Birch Society. We're talking about their organization. We're going to find out what they're all about, maybe answer some of the questions, some of the myths, some of the controversy that has surrounded this organization, and just exactly what they're all about. We're going to take a break here. Phone calls are welcome, 883-9900. Back with Talk of the Town in just a moment. Welcome back, Talk of the Town. Our phone number is 883-9900. Guest today is Harold Shurtleff, who is the New England coordinator for the John Birch Society. We're going to go straight to a call. George from Groton. Good morning, George.
Hey, good morning. You're talking about the Constitution, and I think the gentleman, who's
Hal Shurtleff, George. How you doing?
all right. Well, I didn't get your name in the beginning. I missed the first part. I've heard you on the radio before. Now, what I bring out is that in talking about the Constitution like you are, for years, most of the public has heard supposedly defenders of the Constitution under organizations of civil rights groups, and some of them have done a lot of good and some a lot of harm. But anyway, we thought that these groups were trying to protect the whole Constitution, and they only concentrated mainly on what they call free speech or criminal rights and so forth. But they overlooked about 98% of it.
Well, it's a selective position on the Constitution. Let me give an example.
That's right, and I think the public has been thinking that we've been working on the whole thing. And I'm going to hurry up and listen, but I want to hear your comment on that selective defense of the Constitution. So I'll hang up and listen.
Okay, thank you, George.
Thank you.
Thank you for the call. I just want to mention that not too long ago I was debating a fellow on a radio show in Boston. He was the executive director of CPPAC, which is a Brookline-based left-wing organization, I suppose would be the best definition, kind of an advocacy group for a number of different issues. And we got on the subject of the Second Amendment, and he was all in favor of handgun banning. And I said to him, why does the Second Amendment, why don't you take the Second Amendment as absolute, but not the Fourth? And I gave him an example of a housing project search that was done, I think it was in Chicago or St. Louis, a predominantly black housing project. They were looking for guns. And I said, I didn't hear your organization speak out against this. He said, oh, we did. He said, no, this was terrible. He said, this was a violation of the Fourth Amendment, no illegal search and seizure without probable cause. And I said, why is it the Fourth Amendment so absolute, but not the Second? And he said, you got me there, let's change the subject. And it also showed that when that Second Amendment's on the chopping block, there are a few others that aren't far behind. In fact, a lot of people are afraid to articulate their views because they think they're going to be bugged, they're going to have somebody follow them. In some cases, they're over a little on the paranoid side. But you can understand why they feel that way. You look at the FBI, they want to have more, after the Oklahoma tragedy, they wanted to have the power to bug everybody. Anyone who said, criticized the government, you weren't just like the loyal opposition, you were anti-government, and then you were marked. So I can understand why some people would be concerned about that. But yeah, getting back to, there's a lot of organizations, the ACLU being one of them, American Civil Liberties Union, that when it comes to certain amendments are very selective, and then they, of course, they misinterpret others, or at least they misread them. The First Amendment does not, the separation of church and state isn't even mentioned there. In fact, the man who wrote the First Amendment, who was attributed to writing it, is a man named Fisher Ames, who was from Dedham, Massachusetts. And Fisher Ames in the early 1800s said that the Bible should be the major textbook in all schools. Alan Dershowitz did not write the First Amendment, as some people might think. It was written by Fisher Ames. And that doesn't mean we advocate a state church. We don't want anything to do with a state church. But we think that the First Amendment did not have some kind of wall against people with religious convictions in the political arena.
Well, I know that in some of the literature that I read over that was sent to me by your organization, it said that on the Second Amendment, which is the right to bear arms, correct?
Right.
That people think, well, I can bear arms and I can do whatever I want, but what it said that you always had that right. You always had the right to bear arms, but what the Constitution does is protect that right.
Protect that right. The federal Constitution did not grant any rights to anybody. It simply protected. It said Congress will make no law. And in fact, if you look at it, it's really a list of negative things that Congress cannot do. And the 9th and 10th Amendments basically sum them up. If we didn't mention it, you have that right. Unless we did mention it, you have that right. You see, in England, if the right wasn't mentioned, you didn't have it. It was something the right you didn't possess. But our rights were different. Of course, we have the Constitution at the federal level is very limited in scope. The states have constitutions as well. And in fact, a lot of the amendments did not apply to the state constitutions. However, if you read the New Hampshire State Constitution, Massachusetts Constitution, and others that predated, at least our state, Massachusetts, its constitution predates our federal constitution, there was a lot of plagiarism going on because some things were lifted right out. And in every single constitution, in every state, those basic rights were in there as well, that they were protected.
Now, how does all the gun control tie in with the Second Amendment?
Well, first of all, the federal government has no business making gun control, Brady laws or semi-automatic bans, etc. Although they've been doing it, and Congress has been approving it, they have no legitimacy to do that. State governments can, however, do it, and if their constitution permits it. So if there's to be controls, but you see the problem with gun control is that it really controls people, because you don't control guns, you're controlling the actions of people. And it's a perversion of justice to deny a person a right or control that right based on no conviction of crime. Obviously, if the person is a felon who's used a gun in a crime, maybe as a condition of release, that person is denied the right to own. Or a minor, or a person who may be insane or mentally unstable, those would be legitimate. But as far as just to blanketly condemn everybody, hey, a friend of mine said denying everybody the right to own guns because a few people abuse them is like castrating all men because of some men a small percentage rape. And of course, and just look at the statistics. If we didn't even look at the constitutionality of it, they say that where there's more guns, there's more crime. Now, if that's the case, gun control will work. Well, let's look at Vermont, New Hampshire, and Maine. It's 3 states that, well, one of them we're in, and of course 2 other we're pretty close to, that have the highest per capita gun ownership in the country. But guess what? The lowest murder rates. I mean, Vermont, I travel all throughout New England. I get up to Vermont. You'll find a shotgun rack, even with a Ben & Jerry sticker on the back. You'll still see a shotgun rack with shotguns in their trucks. No drive-by shootings somehow in downtown Royalton, Vermont, or downtown Burlington. It's very, very rare to see a murder in Vermont. You don't find it. But we have a lot of guns up there. So that's got to tell you something. And then we'll say, look at Canada. Canada has a very strict gun control, and they have a very low murder rate. But if we would take a similar population, if you took all the border states, South Dakota, Minnesota, New Hampshire, Vermont, you would find that our rates are even lower where we have the availability of guns.
Well, what I want to know is how then do all the politicians and does the U.S. government make these laws now, which is directly against what the Constitution says?
They do it because Congress allows it to happen, and the American people keep on voting for either the same individuals or those who have the same mindset. We look at the President of the United States sending troops around the world, and he doesn't even have to ask for a declaration of war anymore. We haven't had a declaration of war since World War II.
Mm-hmm.
And he says, well, I have a higher authority. He says, the UN. Well, there's no such thing as a higher authority than our Constitution. But Congress passed a law back in 1945 called the UN Participation Act that gave the President a blank check to wage war with our troops anytime he so pleases. There were some, back during the Vietnam War, there were some limitations of that. It was called the War Powers Act. I think it was passed in the late 60s, early 70s to kind of control that. But if they simply repealed that UN Participation Act and they would demand that they declare war or impeach the President for doing so, then you wouldn't have these U.S. troops being used as the policemen of the world. But unfortunately, there aren't enough people in Congress at this present time. There's more than there were 4 to 6 years ago. And that's the purpose of the Birch Society. It isn't to endorse candidates. It's to inform voters, and those informed voters will in turn put the right people in.
Well, when we come back, we're going to talk more about the John Birch Society and find out if this is true, what is being said, that this is the purpose of the John Birch Society. Why does so much controversy surround this organization? Where does it come from? And the means to what end? We'll find out more on Talk of the Town right after this. How long has the John Birch Society been organized?
Well, it was founded back in December of '58 by the late Robert Welch of Belmont, Massachusetts. And some people who are about my age, a little older, probably remember the Welch's Fudge Bar, the Sugar Daddy. These were inventions of Robert Welch. He was the vice president in charge of sales and marketing of the company. And we're chartered under Massachusetts general laws as a not-for-profit corporation. We are now headquartered in Appleton, Wisconsin. We moved from Belmont, Massachusetts to Appleton back in 1989. And we have chapters all over the country, numerous chapters in every state in the union. And we have a full-time field staff, like myself. I cover almost all New England. I have half of Connecticut, and thankfully, because of the growth of the society, that I'm able to siphon parts of my territory off to make it easier. I can cover a smaller territory. I still have a pretty vast, almost all in New England, so I still get a lot of territory to cover.
Mm-hmm.
And we started forming chapters in early '59 and had some early success stories that didn't sit too well with certain people. One of them was Nikita Khrushchev, by the way. And from, I guess, the early 1960, there has been a smear campaign that was waged against us pretty much unmercilessly for several years, and we were labeled everything you can imagine, from racist to anti-Semitic to anti-Catholic to communist. It depends
which
on
is surprising.
Yeah, everything under the sun, and it wasn't so much what we stood for. It's what we stood for. That people didn't like our message. Certain people didn't like our message.
And what was your message?
Well, we had some serious problems in this country. And the problems weren't necessarily in Moscow or Havana or Peking, but they were in Washington, D.C. and New York City, where the source of all these problems were coming from. And so we were discredited. First of all, we call all these horrible things, so most decent people would want nothing to do with racists or anti-Semites or anti-Catholics or what have you. And then when that didn't work so much, because a lot of people are very honest, and they said, well, let's look at the source of this smear. And that's what got me involved. I said, well, let's look who's really smearing these people, and people that I didn't particularly care for. So I said, let me go to the source to find out. And that's what a lot of people did. Then they tried to discredit Robert Welch.
And the source being?
The source of the smear. Well, it was multiple layers of individuals. There were a lot of people who didn't like what we were doing. So you would say certain liberals, not all liberals, obviously, but certain ones. We know that Nikita Khrushchev came over here for a little trip that was engineered by Eisenhower back in late '59, early '60, And we had a campaign, educational campaign. It was called CASE, Committee Against Some Entanglements. And we had full-page ads in newspapers. Every city that Khrushchev appeared, we had full-page ads describing that this man was a butcher and a monster and a war criminal, among other things, and that he should not be honored with red carpet treatment. And he went back to the Soviet Union. His trip was a disaster, for the most part.
Because of the John Birch Society?
Because of the trip. It was the fledgling John Birch Society, too. And he made a speech to a delegation of Communist Party officials from around the world, and he said that there are forces in the United States that must be publicly whipped, made to suffer the torments of hell. He didn't mention us by name, because there were other type of groups like us. Not so much now, but then there were a few more. Although we are unique. We were then unique, and we are still unique. And then a few months after that, the West Coast Daily Weekly World, communist publication, smeared us. And of course, most Americans don't read that. And if they did, they would automatically disbelieve it because it came from the Communist Party. But some of that information appeared in Time magazine, some of the larger weekly publications. And then for the longest time, there were elements in the media that were, a day wouldn't go by that we weren't smeared. We had a clipping service, and it like every newspaper all over the country. So we know it was an organized campaign. It wasn't just spontaneous.
Excuse me, did the media create this smear or perpetuate it because of they felt it was the truth, or because it made good news?
It may have made good news. Where there was membership was increasing. That's where obviously if there was no John Birches somewhere in Bug Tussle on the hills of Montana, then it wasn't news. But it became very newsworthy because as I say, we were growing, and it was our potential. Something is what frightened certain people. And of course, there are a number of organizations way back then that the certain elements of the union didn't like what we were doing. We had a lot of like left-wing organizations. You had the Fabian Socialist. I'm trying to think of the name of some of these organizations are now defunct. And in fact, there was one called the Fund for the Republic, which was basically set up to discredit us and smear us. Groups like the Anti-Defamation League had a scurrilous book they published, Danger on the Right, where we were mentioned, of course, quite a bit in there. And other individuals, the UN Association, because of our campaign to get us out of the UN, our educational campaign, which is ongoing. So we made quite a few enemies. And there were even certain Republicans that didn't like what we were doing.
Okay, I've lost my train of thought. There's so many things that I want to ask you. Now, your mission statement, your philosophy is what?
Well, the slogan we have is less government, more responsibility, with God's help, a better world. That's basically our mission statement. We realize that we have some serious problems, but they can be stemmed by having an informed electorate. And we inform the American people, and as we get more people informed, some of them are motivated to get involved with the organization, or help out to some capacity, either join or support us or get our information and make it available to others. And then with that informed electorate, you'd be able to beat back a lot of dangerous legislation and support good legislation, and that's what we're trying to do.
Well, how did it get to the point where it is right now in Washington? I'm sure it wasn't a quick process. It was a
very slow
and long process, and I think that I'd like to give people, the politicians, some benefit of the doubt that maybe this philosophy they have and this feeling that they have that they're doing right is something that they learned anyway. It's not really that they're out trying to not do what the Constitution says.
Correct.
And therefore you have these people in power that really feel that they're doing the right thing, but constitutionally it's not the best for the American people.
We're looking at the mess we're in didn't happen overnight. It isn't Bill Clinton's fault. It isn't George Bush's fault. It started way beyond that, and it was a slow process. So you can go back to the turn of the century, where you had an encroaching of more federal power, even with a National Forest Service. That was the beginning. And then you had the Interstate Commerce Act back in 1888 that gave a federal agency too much power, too much authority. You had some amendments that were misinterpreted, misconstrued, to deny people more rights. Then you had World War I, and you had a Federal Reserve System that was set up that basically destroyed our currency. But it didn't happen overnight. It was a slow process. Then you had Franklin Roosevelt.
Well, that's the question that I wanted to ask. How do you feel about Franklin Delano Roosevelt, the statue being erected, and the whole New Deal situation? I mean, when you look back, that seems to have been one of the big turning points where everything went into the social programs.
Right.
And
That was, well, we could look at under Woodrow Wilson. There was a lot of programs. Well, first you had the Second Amendment. The second plank of the Communist Manifesto became the 16th Amendment of our Constitution, the income tax. And although a president doesn't have anything officially to do with an amendment, he has a bully pulpit, as Theodore Roosevelt said. Then you had the Federal Reserve Act of 1913 that Wilson signed, 1913 that Wilson signed, that established a private trust that handles our money. It's a private cartel between government and the bankers. And back then it was sold to the American people as a way just to tax the small percentage of the very rich, 1 or 2%, nothing to worry about. Well, little by little, that 1 or 2% of the very wealthy became like 98% of the middle class. And of course we've seen a great change, and that it was a slow process. We saw a very powerful dollar backed by gold and silver become worthless pieces of paper to be managed by a small group of bankers in New York City. We see the foreign aid. That was World War I. We became the arsenal of democracy. Well, what in the Constitution gave us that power when it was never in there, but people got whipped up in a fevered frenzy. We have to fight the enemy, and we do that. We have to go out and seek monsters to destroy. Then the Depression came along, and it was blamed on greed. You see, greedy people started the Depression. Well, greed was always a factor because it's a human nature. Mm-hmm. But it wasn't just greed. If you really studied the subject, you realize that there was market manipulation, and those who made the most money out of it were probably the ones who knew what was going to go on. It was a shakeout of the market. Mm-hmm. And then, of course, there was a high unemployment, there was hunger, mm-hmm. although I don't think it was massive starvation. And Roosevelt was elected on a very conservative platform, by the way, mm-hmm. very conservative platform. He criticized Hoover for his spending policies, and he went out and did 10 times as much as Hoover would have wanted to do in his wildest dreams, and established so many, we call it alphabet soup in Washington, D.C., all these different federal agencies. They were putting people in jail because they were charging 5 cents less to press shirts. I mean, it was real rotten things that were going on. Then he tried to stack the Supreme Court. He took us off the gold standard. He recognized the Soviet Union, which of course would lend to more bailouts, a bailout of the Soviet Union. And then there was a lot of engineering to get us involved in World War II. The American people did not want to get involved in World War II. It isn't that we supported Hitler, which is nonsense. It's that we did not want to see our troops over there once again. Mm-hmm. And there was, and that's, I guess, a lot to go into in a 2-hour show.
Well, no, I know.
Pearl Harbor and the manipulations and the machinations there. We can debate about that for many years. But after World War II was the UN, the founding. They tried to do it in World War I with the League of Nations. Our Senate wisely said no to the League of Nations, so they had to have another world war to get us into the UN. And the UN was sold to the American people as mankind's last and best hope for peace. And of course, it's not lived up to that. And we said the Marshall Plan, billions of dollars was given to foreign nations around the world, mm-hmm. not to promote necessarily freedom and liberty, but to promote socialism, total government. And that the spigot has not turned off. And then in the 50s, we saw public education, the Sputnik, and everyone was scared that the Russians had this technology. Well, the Russians didn't have any technology unless we gave it to them. But the American people didn't know this. So there was a bill that gave money to colleges and public schools, and then that didn't stop either. And we had another war, well, actually we had 2 wars, the Korean War. The first time the Americans were not allowed to win. It wasn't even a war. It was never declared. When 56,000 Americans die, that to me is a war, but our Congress did not declare war. It was a police action. It led to the takeover of Southeast Asia and eventually Vietnam, another UN subdivision, which was CETO. The UN fought war, which there's no victory was allowed, a lot of bitterness and animosity. So it leads us to the present mess we're in, and we have a lot of cynical people out there, and they're justified in their cynicism. Mm-hmm. They feel it's hopeless. They feel that it's just the way things are. You can't do anything about it. But we say that it can be done. Plenty can be done about it.
So do you feel that there's a great lack of patriotism in the young people nowadays?
Well, I think because you have to define patriotism too. Sometimes it's been defined as love of your government, not love of your nation. And during the Gulf War, we saw a lot of flags everywhere. Support the troops, and nobody was against seeing anything happen to the troop, anything bad. Mm-hmm. But to me, it was a pseudo, or it was not pseudo, but it was a veneer patriotism. It really wasn't very deep. It just said, yeah, we need to support the troops, but the troops shouldn't be there to begin with. That wasn't the other issue addressed. But yeah, I think a lot of people don't have an appreciation of our country.
Well, what is your definition of patriotism?
Well, I think it's a love of your nation, and a love of what it stands for. Now, of course, patriotism has been used in some nations as a perversion. In Nazi Germany is an example of blind nationalism based on hate and total power. But American patriotism is just the opposite. It's based on love of liberty, freedom, that you respect other people's views, and even if you disagree with them, and religious liberty. And that's unique in the world.
Well, we have someone on the phone, Nicole, who did attend the camp, the recent camp. Good morning, Nicole.
Hi.
How are you?
Okay, how are you?
She was an inmate at Robert Welch University.
Oh, you're an inmate. So what, I don't want to say what did you learn, but what was the whole feel of the camp to you? Why did you go there, and how did you leave it?
Well, last year I went because my parents made me, and I went saying, I know I'm going to hate this.
Good for them.
It's going to be so boring. And then I ended up loving it.
Now, Nicole, how old are you, first of all?
I'm 14.
Okay.
Because you learn so much, and you go to all the classes and everything, and it's really amazing what you don't learn in regular schools. And it's not just learning too, it's having a lot of fun and meeting lots of new people.
Now, what are your aspirations for the future? Has this changed your outlook on what you may want to do later on in life?
Yeah, I thought I was becoming like something more like a a lawyer that's like a constitutional lawyer.
Mm-hmm.
And stuff like that, because there's really not enough of them. There's really, people need to like stand up for what is right and like what really the Constitution really says. And there's just not enough people who know.
Now, what do you think is missing in the school system? What do you find is missing in your learning about patriotism, the country, history in general, U.S. history?
Well, I go to Christian school, so they're pretty on the dot on most of the stuff.
Mm-hmm.
But also, sometimes we don't cover a lot of the things. It's like,
Do you say the Pledge of Allegiance every day?
Yep.
Do you do anything with the national anthem?
Usually not.
Mm-hmm.
So it's just, in like some of the history classes, you don't really talk about it that much. You talk about more different places around the world and stuff.
Okay.
So
is there any final thoughts of anybody that might be considering going there? You'd recommend it?
definitely. Even if you have a kid who doesn't want to go, they'll end up loving it. I mean, you're like crying by the end of the week. You don't want to leave.
Now, when you had to write to your congressman, when they had the letter writing section, what did you write about and to whom did you write to?
I wrote to Congressman Bass,
Mm-hmm.
and I wrote 2 letters about the Environmental Agency and how there's a bill, I'm not sure what the name of it is, and they want to, like, put a whole bunch of land things. They want to, like, create all the land that people are living on into animal rights places,
Mm-hmm.
where just animals will be there, and it's really amazing how much they want to take. So I wrote 2 letters opposing that bill,
Okay, and why did you oppose that?
because it just doesn't make any sense. There wouldn't be any places for people left to live. I mean, what would you do? Crowd everybody into little apartments and little towns?
All for the animals, so that's what you're saying, that it should be more for the people.
Right. I mean, people are definitely more important than animals.
Well, Nicole, I want to thank you so much for calling in. I wish you all the best. I think your goal as a constitutional lawyer is a very well-needed one, and we wish you all the best.
Okay, thanks.
Thank you.
Yep.
Very interesting.
Yeah, let me give out the 800 number again that I tried to with Dot, but she was not receptive.
She doesn't want it.
We have an 800 number where you can get information about the society, a copy of our magazine called The New American, position papers, pamphlets. It's a $5 packet, and you can ask to be billed, or you can pay by credit card when you call 1-800-JBS-USA1. You can ask information about the summer camp, and if you want to call my office in Boston, you know, it's area code 617-361-5066, and if you didn't write this down, you call information, ask for the Birch Society in Boston, you get my number.
Okay. Well, we're going to come back. We're going to take a break, come back, and we're going to start in with a few more questions about this supposed New World Order, the conspiracy theory. Are they part of the Ku Klux Klan? Do you have members from that organization? Yours. We're going to have some of these questions answered when we come back right after this. 883-9900. Good morning. This is Talk of the Town. Our guest today is Hal Shurtleff, who is the New England coordinator for the John Birch Society. Now, you've been, if I was to ask some people, well, what about the John Birch Society? Well, all they're right-wing, extremists.
Far right-wing.
Far right-wing. It's the conspiracy theory. Everything is a conspiracy theory. Now, what came to mind last night when I was thinking about it is when you say the word conspiracy, which is sort of what you are saying, that it is the conspiracy theory. Conspiracy is a word that is provocative, antagonistic.
It definitely is. Yeah.
It's a red flag. You wave the word conspiracy in front of...
You elicit emotions. Definitely.
Right. You elicit emotions, you wave it in front of the government, and what are they going to do? They're going to react as they react to the John Birch Society.
Right. First off, we have to define the word conspiracy. And we also have to point out that there are, and I like to point out, there are all kinds of so-called theories out there. You get a lot of people upset and have very little basis in fact. It's just maybe one little piece of circumstantial evidence, a dangling modifier, if you will, and they build a whole theory on that. And when the detractors come to us and say, well, you people believe that there was no moon launch and that Elvis is alive and living in Nashua, New Hampshire at the mall and on, then it ridicules the position. We don't use the word theory. We base it on concrete facts and evidence. Now, I would suggest any attorney that had the facts that we have, or a prosecutor with the facts we have, could make an easy case in a court of law. And that's what, of course, we try to do. We don't have crazy theories. We don't get on shortwave radios and say there's 1 million UN troops just about to pounce on Boston, unless it was happening, you see. And of course, the truth is scary enough without having to embellish it or without having to go into esoteric tangents that have no basis and just get people distracted. And just when I thought I heard them all, I hear 2 or 3 more. That we deal what we write about, and we have a special issue of the magazine called this conspiracy issue. There's no speculation. It's no opinion. It's based on fact. We get the principal individuals involved with this. We get their documentation. We get their writings, and we get the evidence of what they've done. And I think we build a very strong case and a very compelling case. My personal experiences was I was a young man growing up in Boston, and I saw the heavy hand of the federal government, and I didn't really understand why it was happening. This dealt with forced busing. The black people didn't want the forced busing. The white people didn't want it, but we had it, and where we had good racial relations. After that we had nothing but turmoil and bitterness and hatred. And I get into the military, and I find that here is allegedly the most powerful nation in the world, and I was sent to Germany. 2 years in a nuclear unit, by the way, a unit that had nuclear capabilities, and I realized, not being a Army War College graduate, that a Molotov cocktail could have wiped our unit out at any given time. And I was in charge of the repair parts, the maintenance records, and our equipment was junk. And some other veterans said, hey, all the good stuff we left over in Nam. And here we are sitting at what we thought was the front lines, and with nuclear capabilities, yet we had a bunch of scrap heap of supplies. And I said, we're spending $100 billion a year, the U.S. government, U.S. taxpayer, not the government, but the people who pay taxes, to protect West Germany and Western Europe against the Warsaw Pact nations. Then I discovered that West Germany, or the former West Germany, now Germany, was the largest trading partner with the Soviet Union. So I said, wait a minute now, let me sit down and scratch my head, and you mean to say that we are spending $100 billion a year and having all kinds of 3 generations of men and women over there to protect West Germany from its largest trading partner? Something is fundamentally wrong there. So I started asking questions. Never got any answers. Never got any answers. Then Ronald Reagan ran for president, and he said some of the right things. And I thought, well, he's a guy that's worthy of support. But what he said and what he did are 2 different things. I think Shakespeare had one of his characters, I think it was King Henry V. I said a lot of wise things, but did only foolish ones. What really got me was when Reagan authorized a shipment of $500 million worth of military hardware to Red China. This was under the right-wing Reagan. You know, you get some of these professional liberals, that right wing, and they get all their veins pop out. Well, if he was so right-wing and so anti-communist, why did he do that? And they don't have an answer for me. So I realized there was a bigger problem here.
And yet they don't give anybody else an answer either.
No.
When people ask for an answer.
So you're asking questions that should be answered, and you should have a concrete answer instead. Oh, you're one of those conspiracy theorists. Or, oh, you're one of those Birchite types. Well, forget about what I'm thinking. Answer the question, and they don't. Or they'll talk about harmonization, this wonderful global village, and they don't address the issue.
Well, let's take a call. We have Jay.
Yes,
Good morning, Jay.
good morning. I was wondering about that democracy. The spin artists, when they're talking over the politicians, they say something and they kind of spin it around. Now, if I vote for a person and you vote for a person and the neighbor down the street votes for that person, isn't that a democracy?
No, that's a democratic election.
A democratic election?
Right.
Okay.
That's not a democracy. See, a democracy would be majority rule, with at least 50...
Majority votes for you.
But it's not rule. You see, there's a job description that people in Congress take an oath of office. They don't take an oath and say, I will swear that I will obey the wills of the majority. They take an oath of the Constitution. Article 1, Section 1, there's the job description for members of Congress. They have specific things that they can do, powers, and what's not mentioned they cannot do. You see, so when you vote for that person democratically, he or she is held or bound by a Constitution, and that's where the republic, rule by law, comes in. That they cannot say, well, forget the Constitution. 51% of the people voted for me, and 51% of the people say I'm going to do X, Y, Z. So I'm going to do it, and all my colleagues are going to do the same thing.
Because in the republic you rule by law, and in democracy you rule by...
Right. Rule by majority. Now, of course, majority rule, but it's usually a lot of the majority of the individuals, they may be misguided. They may be whipped up into a fevered frenzy by demagogues, and that's the Greek teachers of the people. And we use the demagogue almost pejoratively. So I know it can be a little confusing sometimes, but if you have an old dictionary, get a dictionary that goes back to the 20s, look up the two different terms, and you'll find democracy is probably not very favorably referred to. And in fact, 1928 Army Manual, which is probably impossible to get a hold of, difficult to get a hold of. Although if you want to give me a call, I can send you a copy of it, a copy of what it talked about democracies. It said that mob rule. It talked about mob rule, and effectively it basically corroborated what our founding fathers would said. You get a copy of the Federalist Papers and look up Federalist 10, which was written by, I think it was John Jay. You can pick that up in the National Library, and even a lot of bookstores still have this, and it would tell you what they talked about democracies.
But Jay, does that answer your question, the difference between a democratic election and a democracy?
No, but you have to be a qualified voter. Not everybody can vote in an election. You have to be a certain age. You have to be a citizen. You should be able to read the language, although that's no longer a requirement. So we don't have unbridled democracy because not everybody can vote. I don't think 3-year-olds should be voting. I don't think foreigners should be voting, although they do. I should say unnaturalized citizens, although in some cases
and sometimes dead people.
And a lot of dead people, especially in Boston.
Chicago.
Well, Chicago, sure. In Boston, we have this vote often and early for James Michael Curley, you see. And I'm sure you have the same thing for Daley, Mayor Daley.
Yeah, Curley, the same thing, huh? Yeah, Daley.
Okay, Jay, well, thanks so much for calling in.
Okay, thanks.
All right, bye-bye. Do we have time for one more quick call? Who do we have?
1 minute left.
Who do we have?
Will.
Put him on for just... Will?
Yeah?
Good morning. We have to go into the news break. Do you want to hang on?
Okay.
Okay, thanks so much.
Yeah.
We'll be back with more Talk of the Town, the John Birch Society, right after this. Don't go away. Welcome back, Talk of the Town, 883-9900. Good morning. We're speaking with Harold Shurtleff, who is the New England coordinator for the John Birch Society, and we have Will on the line. Will, thanks for holding.
Oh, good morning.
Good morning.
Mr. Shurtleff, I'm glad you're on the air.
Well, thank you for calling.
I had a question for you. I'm a person who's been involved in mostly, Republican politics for a number of years. Back some years ago, I was an officer of the Republican City Committee. But I've become increasingly concerned that outside of Bob Smith, who tends to vote right most of the time, we have even Republicans in a pretty conservative place like New Hampshire that are increasing foreign aid. If I've got my numbers correct, this new budget that we've just pushed through increases foreign aid from, I think, to around $13 billion. It was a $1 billion increase. I was just curious, do you see any solution when we can always throw stones at Democrats, but the bottom line is we have Republicans that are actually spending money left and right, and I don't see any of that being authorized in the Constitution. And I was curious if you had a comment or solution.
We have a solution to that problem. It's called TRIM, Tax Reform Immediately, and it's these little report cards, which I'm giving one now to
Thank you.
Debbie. What we do is we take 8 of the most expensive bills that were passed within the last 120 days, and a brief description of the bill, what it costs per household when a bill is passed, so the taxpayers pick up the tab, and then how they voted on it. And of course, the bulletin is a little legal size that we fold over. The first 3 pages are little facts to educate, little facts and tidbits of information. In the back, of course, would be the voting record. We use the same 8 votes in every single congressional district. We don't pick and choose and make some look good and some look bad. We don't list what party the person belongs to, just the district. For example, Charlie Bass, his Washington office, his D.C., his local office, and then fax numbers and email addresses, etc. Well, members and friends of the society will get these bulletins and distribute them. And there are many cases where the Republicans or even the Republican candidates or Republican members of the House will look worse than their Democrat colleagues. In fact, thanks to Bernie Sanders, the socialist from Vermont, we have what they call the Sander-Niester Index, where we take Bernie's record and we base it upon that. Are you a socialist? Do you vote to the left or the right of Bernie? And we found that something like 20 Republicans vote to the left of Bernie consistently. So what does that tell them? If Bernie's a socialist, and he'll admit it, we're not McCarthyites because we're labeling him a socialist. He's very proud of the fact that he is. And he votes more conservatively than some Republicans. Now, I have John Sununu's most recent voting record. He's not in this district, but I'm sure you do have some listeners. John Sununu is supposed to be a fiscal conservative. I only have 2, but
wow, he has a lot of X's there.
Now the X means he votes for high taxes, and we're not talking we're talking about bills that are over $1 billion and are unconstitutional. He has 1 star. He voted against a State Department authorization bill that would have saved the taxpayers $530 million. Well, thank you, John, for voting against that. However,
that's 1 out of 8.
1 out of 8. Now, if he was playing baseball, he'd be sent back down to the minors. Sent down to the Lowell team, maybe if it was a major league team. I suggest that the voters who put him in, thinking that they were getting a fiscal conservative, maybe as governor, he was half decent on that regard. I'm not sure. It was a few years ago. I can't recall. He was somewhat of a tax. He liked lower taxes, but now he's in the big leagues. He's spending all your money. He's not doing it.
It's actually father and son.
Right.
So we're talking about 2 different people.
Oh, this is the former governor who became John Sununu. Okay, well he was governor. Wasn't he governor?
His father was governor, right?
Wasn't he the? Oh, okay. Wasn't he the aide to George Bush? This Sununu.
That was the father.
Oh, okay. I'm sorry. He looks a lot like. He looks a lot like.
Doesn't look like him exactly.
Geez, he looks like. I'm sorry. My apologies to the former governor here. So, well, anyway, his son is a big tax. He likes big taxes by his record, and it's not what he says. It's not what we like him or not. It's not what party he belongs to, and of course, the parties nominate candidates. And a lot of parties, in Massachusetts, the Republican Party is a disgrace. They got a guy like Bill Weld, who had been governor. I'll give you an example of how our TRIM committees in action will work. Ron Paul is now the Republican from Texas, and I forget which district it was. And he had been a member of Congress back in the 70s and early 80s, ran for the Senate, lost his seat, and he went back to his practice. He's a doctor. Well, he decided to see if he could get his old seat back, and the man who was sitting in his seat was his old seat was a Democrat. Well, Newt Gingrich encouraged him to change parties. So the D became an R, uppercase D became an uppercase R. The voting record remained very liberal, very big spending, although now he was a member of Newt Gingrich's kindergarten. He was promised a position, committee chairmanship, so it was appealing, enticing talk show hosts like Rush Limbaugh, we're winning, look at another guy jumped ship. Well, he may have changed parties, but he didn't change his philosophy, and so it's really ridiculous. It means nothing. Well, he ran against Ron Paul. Now, Ron Paul had a track record, a proven track record of being a fiscal conservative. I mean, he scored 100 on our trim bulletins consistently for, I think, 6 years in a row. Very good. You'd think all these fiscal conservatives would love a guy like Ron Paul. Well, guess what? The big money from the Republican Party went to this, and I forget the man's name, went to this former Democrat, liberal Republican, and George Bush. Ron Paul won. Okay. Ron Paul won in spite of all the money that was being sent. George Bush campaigned, the son campaigned, who's governor of Texas. I think Newt Gingrich went into campaign for this former Democrat, now liberal Republican, and the John Birch Society did not endorse Ron Paul, but we put the voting record out, thousands of them, hundreds of thousands of trim bulletins within a very short period of time, and Ron Paul won by a very large margin. And Ron Paul will tell people that the trim committees made the difference. Ron Paul now has a bill in Congress to get us out of the UN. So you know Ron Paul's our kind of guy, even though we never endorsed him.
Out of curiosity, what do you think about our two-party system? Do you think a third-party system would help us or hurt us, like the U.S. taxpayer party? I'm one of those people who was disappointed that Pat Buchanan didn't actually jump and go to a U.S. taxpayer party. You could love or hate Pat,
right,
but he had enough momentum going that it actually could have changed our dynamic here quite a bit. And I'm just curious, do you think a solution is a third party, or do you think that parties are reformable?
Well, I think the parties may not be reformable, but the candidates within the parties are possible. So I'm not a really big advocate of third parties. I wouldn't discourage people, but I know a lot of people have been involved with third parties and spent a lot of time and money and really got nowhere. Libertarian Party in New Hampshire is probably the strongest third party, and they lost their accreditation, recently ballot status. My advice to a third party would be to run for local office, get elected statewide first, instead of trying to go for the big office, the big vote, and then get a couple elected to Congress. We only have one independent third party, and that would be Bernie Sanders in the House of Representatives in the United States Congress. And of course, the Republican Party is the first successful third party, so it is a third party. But I think the effort should be at trying to find decent people within the two parties. Although again, I'm not trying to discourage people. I just my experience and people I know have spent a lot of time spinning their wheels.
Well, see, Will, what I have a problem with is with the two-party system, right? And the proof is in the story you just gave, that this man switches parties and remains the same. So how do you know that when you're voting Republican that that's what you're getting?
You don't know what you're getting.
I mean, this is the problem that I have. You say you're a Republican, you want to vote. You vote your ticket straight, and support your party. Yet people are hopping all around and doing whatever they want in the long run.
Well, the other thing is the committees. And several years ago, we had a congressman named Dick Sweat. Now, he actually put some stuff in writing and blatantly lied to the constituents.
In fact, I saw the letter. It was dealing with, I think, one of the gun bills.
Yeah, and he's no longer a congressman. But as we started examining his record, you start seeing, gee, the final vote wasn't so bad. And of course, on that actual vote that he got in trouble with, he was the last person to vote. And it was when the Democratic power brokers said, "We need your vote, and we don't care what you promised. We paid for this seat." I mean, and I don't want to throw mud at Democrats or Republicans here because there's a lot of this party brokerage going on in both. But the bottom line is, he had to vote the way the money told him to vote. But what we started seeing is, even though when his votes weren't important, he voted the right way, at least from my viewpoint. But in the committees, all these little votes, as it comes out of committee and you say, we added on a playground here, $2 million for someplace in California. Well, he always voted to spend money. And then in the final vote, he would vote against it. And I guess it was called an excused vote. But this upsets me that it's not just Democrats who do this. And sometimes you see that, they said, well, this was the best we could get. Well, the thing is, excuse me, but you're my rep. Where were you in this committee?
Right.
And they just keep inflating things. And
there's a lot of selective voting. Now, for example, and I've known political aides have told me this, and a few members of Congress will say this is what happens. Let's suppose there's a controversial bill. and they know there's not enough votes to beat it. So it's safe to vote against it, or vote for it, however the case may be. And they can come back home and say, I'm the champion of the downtrodden, the champion of the gun owners, the champion of whatever they want to be the champion of that day. Yet, when it came down to the wire, if they needed the vote, they may have voted the wrong way. My Congressman Joe Moakley on NAFTA, I called his office an hour before the vote, and he wasn't sure. He gets on the radio a half an hour before the vote, and he sounds like a John Bircher. We can't have this, but he said, we're not going to win it. We can't. I've been fighting. He's lying. He realized that there was enough votes to give the president his NAFTA, then he could vote against it and look good to the unions. Well, he took no leadership position. So that happens a lot, and it's up to the informed voters to keep an eye on this and make sure that stuff. So it's not easy. There's no simple solution or there's no quick fix. But when they start doing this, that's when you know it's time for these guys to get out of office. If they're bought, if they rely upon their seat because of the big PACs, then that person doesn't represent you. He represents PACs, and he should be out of office. And you should do what you can to inform everybody who has a misinformed opinion on that. Even people who may like him, but say, how can you trust the guy now? He's now a captive of the PACs, or he thinks he's a captive of the big money. He's not going to vote the interest of the Constitution or his district. So he's time for that person to go.
I just want to make one little quick comment. First of all, thank you and our host for having you on. We really need to have more radio programs like this. But I happened to listen to the news in the interim there, and Bill Clinton is just about to sign this big thing that in all executive branch buildings there's going to be no smoking allowed. But in this Sunday's paper, there was this article about how his wife is upset that every time he sinks a putt in the little golf course he set up behind the White House, he pulls out a stogie and lights up. I wonder if he's going to make it apply to himself.
Doesn't that just say it all, though, about Bill Clinton?
Well, you see, laws are written for the average, the masses. They're not written for the elitists. Joe Kennedy, that marvelous bastion of intellect in Massachusetts, he and his son were lighting firecrackers. Now, a lot of people do that in Massachusetts. It's against the law, but a lot of people do it. It doesn't make it right because it's against the law. And his son had some burned his hand. Now, if that were me and it was my child, DSS, the Department of Social Services, would have come in, probably taken my kid away from me, probably had me up for charges, and I would have been disgraced in the newspaper saying, right-wing Bircher, gives kids firecrackers, and I would have been hounded out of town.
And breaks the law.
And breaks the law, and I'm evil, and I'm a hypocrite. Yet Joe Kennedy, nothing at all was done about it. And he'd probably run for governor and probably get elected by these sweet old ladies who think he's just so cute, but the laws are not written for him. They're not written for... You look at these civil rights laws. When they write the law, they automatically exclude themselves from its compliance. So they're hypocrites.
Well,
of course, they've got a lot of voters bought. Well, he votes my way on this issue, so I don't care. Well, it's going to become a time when it's starting to hurt. It's going to be hurting a lot more.
Well, we have that same problem right here in Nashua, though, and I've never met this gentleman, but we have a cop named Pavino, and he made the mistake of arresting Warren Rudman's son on a drunken driving charge, and somebody got it. It would appear as though somebody got it thrown out. Of course, he's since been arrested. This Rudman's son has been arrested in Vermont and all sorts of other places. It looks like it's a chronic problem.
Yes, a very chronic problem.
And I thank the Telegraph for actually covering this, but it seems as though, I don't know who hates this cop, but there seems to be a whole thing to disgrace him going on in Nashua.
Well, the incident at Chappaquiddick back in 1968 or 69.
I've been to that bridge.
The man who, the skin diver, he had to leave the Cape because of all he was getting all kinds of problems. He simply wanted to see justice done. No way, you're out. You're out. And there's some politicians that are very powerful, and unfortunately, people, when they get in their way, they get destroyed.
Well, it seems to happens to the Kennedys a lot, where heads are just turned,
And they got that smile. I tell you, they're born with that smile. All right. Well, thank you so much for joining us. Thank you. We're going to take a break. Come back and find out: is the power of change within our hands? We'll find that out right after this. Welcome back, Talk of the Town. We're finishing up our show today. Our guest has been Hal Shurtleff, who is the New England coordinator for the John Birch Society. We've heard different views from a lot of people, from yourself, and all of us wondering, what's happened, bemoaning the state of the union, the lack of control that we have, the people that are in office, and do you think that the burden is on our shoulders, or does the answer lie within our grasp, I guess?
Yes, it does lie on our shoulders. Again, we're supposed to be a free nation of sovereign citizens, and in fact, theoretically, the people establish the government. The people can make the changes. So it's up to the individuals to get an understanding of what's going on and then take some legal, tasteful, moral action to address and reverse the trend that we're in. And I don't think it can happen very quickly. In fact, we like to say that we can have a non-violent revolution at the ballot box every 2 years. In 1994, there was a big turnover. And a lot of those people who elected are still in there. They're really sound constitutionalists, and we just need to keep the momentum going, not to be distracted, not to go off on tangents, and we need more people informed. And what's great about the Birch Society, and there's other organizations, of course, that are doing likewise. Although again, we are unique because of the way we're structured. We're on the World Wide Web. We have a website page. We're getting something like 12,000 hits a day. We're getting new chapters, new members. We're getting public access.
And what do you think? Why do you think there's this
Well,
this
because
surge?
what we've been saying is more apparent now. Back in the 60s and 70s and 80s, we talked about the UN becoming stronger and more powerful, and global government. And they said, "Oh, that's kind of, we like your positions on taxes and on the guns, but on the pro-life issue. But when it comes to this, I don't believe in this conspiracy. But when they saw a young man that was court-martialed because it wouldn't wear a UN uniform, when they see NAFTA and GATT, and that these agreements, not even treaties, but agreements, superseded our Constitution, which should be illegal, then you say, maybe those kooks and nuts, maybe they got something there after all. Let me leave their maybe start looking into them. And we've had a lot of people apologize to us. Had a talk show host down in Middletown, Connecticut, that used to spoof the Conspiratorial Review. And again, there are some ridiculous theories out there that should be spoofed. Well, it was John Birch that said, I'll fix him. He sent him a book. That book was called Shadows of Power. Well, this poor guy, who was a 60s radical, by the way, in the 60s, he was one of these real student activists. Abby Hoffman is my best friend type of guy, and became somewhat of a libertarian in the years. Well, he ended up becoming a John Birch member. So we fixed him, you know. And I was a guest on his show every time I was in town. He would put me on, and he would tell a story that anybody would want to hear. He said, I thought this was crazy, it was ridiculous, and I would ridicule it until I started looking into it. And that's the problem. People don't look into it. Or they may pick up some ridiculous scandal sheet and say, yeah, this is foolish. But if they look into our information, I guarantee they're not going to put it down saying, oh, this is a lot of baloney. You're going to be, even if you disagree with the conclusions, you're going to find out that they're not based on insane speculations, but on sound reasoning and sound facts and information.
And you had brought up a point during the break about, we were talking about the conspiracy and the conspiracy theory and the word conspiracy, that even on the level of the Pamela Smart conspiracy, there's conspiracies on every level. Conspiracy is not this big, dark, huge cloud of everything. It happens on smaller levels, and you said there's no reason why we should think that there wouldn't be a conspiracy in a government level.
And we don't say that every congressman who votes the wrong way is a conspirator. We don't think that if there's a hurricane and a tornado, it was a tornado here in Swansea, New Hampshire, it wasn't somehow a conspiracy to manipulate the weather or some ridiculous thing. But there are a lot of events that are manufactured or are taken advantage of. And as some people will say, the government bombed Oklahoma, the building. Well, we have, when you say the government, what are you talking about? You're talking about the postal man, you're talking about the IRS guy down the street, you're talking about Bill Clinton. Who are you talking about?
Good
and people
point,
had to be specific. And then maybe an element within the government had some complacency or something to do with it. There's not enough evidence right now to make that conclusion, but there's enough to raise questions. But some people will go off on a tangent and say, the government did this, the government did that. And you're talking about every member of Congress, you're talking about everybody who gets a government check is somehow involved, and that's not true. But we do know that there is an element within the government and without. You find them in academics, you find them in the groups like the Council on Foreign Relations, the Trilateral Commission, and on and on. They have an agenda, and their agenda is pretty much clear-cut and it's laid out. If you were to get them on a talk show and say, do you want a one world government, most of them will say, oh, come on, that's ridiculous. But then you get their dissertation they did, or a speech they made to the World Federalist, and there it is right there, that they want some kind of world government.
Now, how about the accusations that you're involved with the Ku Klux Klan, the militiamen, the freemen, and all of that?
Well, you'd have to ask our black and Jewish members about the Ku Klux Klan charge, because it's ridiculous. If there were Klansmen in the organization, they come to meetings and they find there are blacks and there are Jews, and we don't judge people by the color of the skin, which is really a form of socialism, when you collectivize and put people in certain groups. So they say this is no place for them, so please go somewhere else. The militia, there are a lot of people in the militia that I think are answering the right questions. But I think, and of course we have to define the term militia again,
Right.
because according to a federal regulation, a federal law, that all able-bodied males from the age of 18 to 45 constitute the unorganized militia. And militias in certain states, and every state has different guidelines to militias, and I think New Hampshire, you can have an organized militia that is separate from the National Guard. I'm not positive on that, but I think that, but you still have to be answerable to the governor. So, but we're talking about basically groups of people who are private citizens that are organizing to defend themselves against what they see as an imminent military threat. And I can understand the concerns, but I think that the solution isn't necessarily to get the guns and groceries and head for the hills. This is our country, and I know some people who are involved, and I say, look, I live in Boston. I grew up there. My ancestors settled there 200, 300 years ago. I'm staying put. I'm not going to let anybody chase me out. And I want to win. I don't want to lose. And having that siege mentality is a sign that you've already admitted defeat. So that's where where we stand on the militia.
We only have, a minute or so left. A wrap-up, final comment.
Can I just give out 800 number
Sure,
again?
certainly.
For those of you who would like some information, whether you agree or disagree, 1-800...
Excuse me, the John Birch Society.
John Birch Society, JBS, 1-800-JBS-USA1. $5 packet, you'll get a copy of our magazine, ask for information on the summer camp, trim bulletin, all kinds of information.